A rain-soaked island in the North Atlantic, smaller than the state of Oregon, once ruled a quarter of the land on Earth and gave orders to nearly 1 in 4 human beings alive. By the early 20th century, the British Empire governed roughly 412 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population. By 1920, it covered around 13.5 million square miles of land, roughly a quarter of the entire surface of the planet. No empire before or since has ever spread so far. And the thing that built it, the seed of the whole monstrous machine, was not a warlord, not a crown, not a conquering army. It was a group of London merchants trying to get a better price on pepper. Sit with that, because it's genuinely strange. The largest empire in human history did not begin with a plan to conquer the world. It began as a business meeting. A few hundred men who wanted a share of a spice trade they'd been shut out of. That's the origin. That's the whole tiny acorn from which the biggest oak in history grew.
And the story of how you get from a pepper cartel to owning a quarter of the planet is one of the strangest, darkest, and most human stories in all of history. If you find that as fascinating as I do me a small favor and subscribe. This channel is built on exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that sound invented but aren't. And there's a lot more coming. Now let's go back to the beginning, because the beginning is nothing like what you'd expect. In the 1500s, England was not a great power. It was a wet, rainy, second-rate kingdom huddled on the edge of Europe, watching everyone else grow rich. The real players were down south. Spain and Portugal had done something no one in Europe had ever managed. They'd sailed around the world and found the source of the wealth. In the 1420s, the Portuguese monarchy became the first in Europe to seek wealth overseas. Spain, unified with the conquest of Granada, sponsored its first overseas expedition that same year. France and England lagged behind, not establishing overseas colonies and trade routes until after 1600. Think about what that meant on the ground. Spain, in the later 1500s, was fabulously prosperous, its wool industries flourishing, its cities swelling. A steady stream of galleons pouring American treasure onto European docks. Ships arriving in Seville, groaning under the weight of silver, so much of it that it warped the whole economy of Europe. Meanwhile, England had wool. That was more or less it. Damp fields, sheep, and wool. The country's one great export was heavy woolen cloth. And here's the cruel joke of it. The places worth trading with were hot. Southeast Asian traders found no use for English wool in the hot climate of their islands. Picture trying to sell winter coats on a beach in the tropics. That was England's opening pitch to the wealthiest markets on Earth. And what those markets had, England desperately wanted. Spices. Not as a luxury, as a genuine obsession. In a world with no refrigeration, spices preserved food, masked the taste of meat going bad, signaled wealth, and were believed to cure disease. For centuries, the trade had crawled overland across Asia and the Middle East, through a chain of middlemen, each taking a cut, until a sack of pepper reached a London market at a price that would make your eyes water. Then the Portuguese figured out how to sail straight around Africa to the source and cut every one of those middlemen out and pocket the difference. The English watched this and did the math. And the thing that finally lit the fuse was almost comically petty. Political disruptions caused the price of pepper to almost triple, and news of a successful voyage to Asia by the Dutch encouraged London merchants to enter the trade. That's it. That's the spark that would one day become an empire. The price of pepper jumped. The Dutch were getting rich off it, and a room full of London merchants decided they wanted in. On the last day of the year 1600, on New Year's Eve,
they got their wish.
Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to more than 200 City of London investors to set up a new company, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies, which became known as the East India Company. For a period of 15 years, the charter awarded the company a monopoly on English trade with all countries east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. Read that again slowly, because it tells you everything about the mindset of the age. A queen, with a stroke of a pen, handed a private club of merchants the exclusive right to trade with roughly half the surface of the earth. Everything from the tip of Africa all the way around to the far side of the Pacific. She had no meaningful power in most of that space. She'd never seen it. Whole civilizations older and richer than England lived there and had no idea this document existed. But on paper, in a room in London, it was signed away to a company. It's a bit like a mayor of one small town handing a local shopkeeper the deed to a hemisphere. And the men who took that deed were not saints. The charter was driven by more than 200 petitioners, including merchants, nobles, and some with interests in piracy, a blend of ambition unshackled by strict morality. Businessmen and pirates. Men who saw the ocean as a place where fortunes were made by whoever was boldest and least squeamish about how. The first voyages set out with a problem they couldn't solve. They had nothing the East wanted to buy. So they did the only thing that worked. England's main product was woolen cloth, for which there was little interest in warm climates. Other manufactures were inferior to those produced in Asia. The company had to trade mainly with bullion, and it was given the right to export silver, something previously illegal, in order to purchase spices. Let that land. England was so far behind that its great trading enterprise's opening strategy was to ship out raw silver and buy things with cash, because it made nothing anyone abroad actually wanted. This is not the posture of a superpower. This is a poor kingdom, scraping together its savings and hoping to buy its way into a game the grown-ups were already winning. But it worked. God, did it work. The profits on a successful voyage were not the kind of returns you see today. The 8th voyage alone provided subscribers with a 221% profit, more than doubling your money in a single trip. In 1 year, the company brought back to London £2 million weight of pepper. Imagine a caravan of wealth arriving at the docks, and every man who'd bought a share suddenly rich. Word spread. More investors, more ships. The trickle became a flood. And now watch what happens next, because this is where the story stops being about spice and starts becoming something the world had never seen before. The company was supposed to trade. Just trade. Buy low in the East, sell high in London, pay the shareholders, repeat. But out on the far side of the world, thousands of miles from any authority that could stop it, the company started to change shape. It began doing things that no business had any right to do. Things that only governments do. Look at the powers it accumulated. In a series of royal grants in the later 1600s, the English crown gave the company a set of rights that sound frankly insane when you list them out. King Charles II granted the company the rights to autonomous territorial acquisitions, to mint money, to command fortresses and troops and form alliances, to make war and peace, and to exercise both civil and criminal jurisdiction over the areas it acquired. Stop and unpack that. A trading company was legally allowed to seize land, to print its own currency, to raise armies, to sign treaties with foreign kings, to declare war, to arrest you, try you, and hang you. Those are not the powers of a business. Those are the powers of a country. And that's precisely what the East India Company was becoming. A country that happened to have shareholders. A state within a state.
even an empire within an empire, and one accountable to no one except its investors. Picture the absurdity of it from the outside.
Somewhere in the world, a soldier is marching, a cannon is being fired, a treaty is being signed, a coin is being struck with an official seal, and behind all of it, the entity giving orders is not a nation. It's a company. Its ultimate loyalty is not to a flag or a people. It's to a dividend, to a return on investment. Every conquest, every war, every famine that followed traces back to that single, strange fact. This was violence in the service of a balance sheet, and it minted money to match. The company didn't just control trade, it printed its own money. The issuance of currency is a privilege reserved strictly for sovereign nations. Yet the company minted coins bearing its emblem and circulated them widely across the territories it controlled. Hold one of those coins in your mind's eye. It looks like a nation's money. It functions like a nation's money. But it belongs to a corporation. There has never been anything quite like it. As if a modern tech company started issuing its own dollars, backed by its own soldiers, in territory it had taken by force. The army is the part that truly breaks the mind. Over the following century, the company built up a fighting force that beggars belief. At its peak, the company had its own armed forces in the form of 3 presidency armies, totaling about 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army at certain times. Read that one more time. A private company had an army twice the size of its own home country's army. If you're trying to picture the scale, imagine a single corporation today fielding a military force larger than that of Britain, France, or Canada, fully equipped, with artillery and cavalry and its own navy, and answering to a boardroom. Most of that army wasn't even British. As the historian Ian Barrow notes, it is one of the great ironies of the company's history that its Indian empire was effectively won by Indian troops. The men who conquered the subcontinent for a London company were overwhelmingly Indians, recruited, drilled in European fashion, and pointed at their neighbors. That detail alone should tell you the conquest was never really about numbers of Englishmen. It was about organization, money, and the ruthless exploitation of division. So now we had the machine, a company with a navy, an army, a mint, courts, and the legal right to wage war, floating out at the edge of the known world with almost no one watching it. All it needed was an opportunity. A crack in the wall of some rich and vulnerable place wide enough to push through. And in the middle of the 1700s, in the wealthiest province of the wealthiest empire in Asia, that crack appeared. The place was Bengal. To understand what happened there, you have to understand what Bengal was. This was no backwater. Bengal was India's richest province, a land of legendary abundance, fertile beyond belief, packed with people, humming with the finest textile workshops on earth, producing cottons and silks so fine that the whole world wanted them. It sat inside the Mughal Empire, which had ruled most of the subcontinent for 2 centuries, and had once been so powerful that the company's envoys had literally been made to grovel before its emperor. When a Mughal fleet attacked the company's base at Bombay, the company was forced to surrender and send envoys to the emperor's camp to plead for a pardon. The envoys had to prostrate themselves before the emperor, pay a large indemnity, and promise better behavior. That's worth holding on to. Within living memory of what came next, the company had been on its knees, begging an Indian emperor for mercy. That's how the balance of power actually stood. The idea that a handful of merchants might one day rule this land would have sounded like a lunatic's fantasy. But by the middle of the 1700s,
The great Mughal Empire was rotting from the inside. The Mughal Empire, which had once controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, was in a state of collapse as native Indian and European states attempted to carve out their own political and economic power bases.
When the center weakens, the provinces drift free. Bengal was now run by its own local ruler, a Nawab, who in theory answered to the emperor, but in practice ruled his rich land as his own. And in the 1750s, the throne passed to a young man, barely out of his teens, inexperienced, and about to make a series of moves that would end with his entire world in the hands of a foreign corporation. His name was Siraj-ud-Dowlah. He was just 20 years of age, and he could see, correctly, that the English were becoming a problem. They were fortifying their trading base at Calcutta without his permission, abusing their trade privileges, and behaving less like guests and more like a rival power growing inside his own borders. So he did what any ruler would do. He moved against them. In 1756, Siraj-ud-Dowlah attacked the company's Bengal settlements, seizing Calcutta. And in the aftermath came the incident that the British would tell and retell for 2 centuries to justify everything that followed: the so-called Black Hole of Calcutta. The story, as the British repeated it, was that after the city fell, British prisoners were crammed into a tiny, airless cell overnight, and most of them suffocated. According to the traditional account, only a handful of the prisoners survived captivity in a cell meant for about 6 people. Now, historians have argued for a very long time about the real numbers. The figures given at the time were almost certainly wildly inflated, and modern scholars treat the lurid death tolls with deep suspicion. But the truth barely mattered for what came next. What mattered is that the company now had a story, a grievance, a reason. The man they sent to answer it would change the shape of the world. And he was, of all things, a former clerk. Stand for a moment in the position of Robert Clive. Formerly a writer, a clerk, Clive had switched to the company's military service, and his tactical flair and personal bravery had earned him rapid promotion and a great personal fortune. He'd come out to India as a bored, difficult young office worker, filling in ledgers, and he'd discovered a talent for war that no one, including himself, had expected. Now he was sailing north with a small army to take back Calcutta and settle accounts with the young Nawab. In his head, something bigger was forming than mere revenge. It was Clive who dreamed about becoming the first governor of a British India. He retook Calcutta easily. He seized the French trading post nearby, cutting off the Nawab's only European ally. And then he prepared to do something that had almost nothing to do with soldiering, and everything to do with the cold logic of a corporation. He was outnumbered, badly. The Nawab could field tens of thousands of men. Clive had a few thousand. In a straight fight, he should have lost. So he decided not to fight a straight fight. He decided to buy one instead. This is the move that reveals what the empire really was, underneath the flags and the speeches. Clive found the men around the young Nawab who resented him, who wanted his throne, who could be turned. Chief among them was the Nawab's own cavalry commander, who was secretly bribed by the British. The deal was simple and breathtaking in its cynicism. Betray your master on the battlefield. Do nothing. Hold your troops back. And when it's over, we will make you the new ruler of Bengal. A puppet on a throne, propped up by a company. The great bankers of Bengal, the Jagat Seths, and the company secretly offered to make the Nawab's army commander the new Nawab if the young ruler was defeated in battle. Picture the men in that conspiracy. Not one traitor, a whole web of them. Disaffected generals, immensely wealthy bankers who financed the state,
and had decided their money was safer with the newcomers, a rich merchant demanding his cut. The young Nawab, sensing something was wrong, actually forced his commander to swear loyalty on the Quran. Fearing treason, the ruler asked the general to pledge his faith on Holy Scripture, a request the general could hardly refuse, and he had already sold his master to the enemy.
So they came to a mango grove near a village called Plassey, on the bank of a river on a wet June day. On one side, an army of tens of thousands with cannon and war elephants. On the other, Clive's few thousand. It looked, on paper, like a slaughter waiting to happen. The wrong way for the English. The Nawab's army of about 50,000 soldiers, 40 cannons and 10 war elephants was defeated by 3,000 soldiers under Clive, and it barely deserves the name battle. The battle lasted no more than a few hours, and the outcome had been decided long before the soldiers came to the field. The Nawab's own cavalry commander had been induced to throw in his lot with Clive, and by far the greater number of the Nawab's soldiers were bribed to throw away their weapons, surrender prematurely, and even turn their arms against their own army. Then the weather did the rest. A monsoon downpour swept the field. The British won after heavy rain soaked the Nawab's gunpowder, while Clive's gunners had covered theirs with tarpaulins. The Nawab's artillery fell silent. His troops, seeing their own commander refuse to move, wavered. And the young ruler, 20 years old, watched his enormous army dissolve around him, not because it was beaten, but because it had been sold. He fled the field. He was captured and murdered soon after, on the order of the very man who had sworn loyalty to him on Holy Scripture. Take a breath here, because I want you to feel the weight of what just happened. The richest province in India, one of the wealthiest places on the entire planet, had just changed hands. Not through a great war, not through some epic clash of civilizations, through a bribe, a broken oath, and a rainstorm. This was as much a coup as an actual battle. Clive's triumph eliminated any hope that India would remain free of foreign rule. The Indian statesman Jawaharlal Nehru would later put it with brutal precision. He described Clive as having won the battle by promoting treason and forgery, and pointedly noted that British rule in India had an unsavory beginning. Now comes the moment that tells you, more clearly than any battle, what all of this had really been for. In the days after Plassey, Clive rode into the old capital and was taken to the treasury of Bengal, the accumulated wealth of one of the richest states in the world. Years later, hauled before Parliament back in London and accused of enriching himself outrageously, Clive did not deny walking into that vault. He described it, and his own words survive. Consider the situation in which the victory at Plassey had placed me. A great prince was dependent on my pleasure. An opulent city lay at my mercy. Its richest bankers bid against each other for my smiles. I walked through vaults which were thrown open to me alone, piled on either hand with gold and jewels. Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation. Astonished at his own moderation. Read that again and let it turn your stomach a little. A man is on trial for looting a nation, and his defense is not that he didn't do it. His defense is that he could have taken more. That he showed restraint by only taking a fortune. He didn't deny taking money. He only denied taking too much. And the numbers behind that moderation are staggering. Clive established the military and political supremacy of the company by securing victory in Bengal and looting its treasury of an amount estimated in the billions in modern terms. A former clerk, still in his early 30s,
walked out of that province one of the richest men in England. But Clive's personal fortune is almost a footnote next to what the company took. Because the true prize wasn't the gold in the vault. It was the right to reach into the pockets of every farmer, weaver, and merchant in Bengal, forever. Within a few years, the shattered Mughal emperor formally granted the company the Diwani. The emperor recognized British power by granting the East India Company the office that gave it official authority to collect taxes on 10 million Bengalis, making the company the virtual rulers of Bengal. Read that sentence and understand what it means, because it is the true birth of the empire. A company, a business, with shareholders in London who had never set foot in Asia, now had the legal right to tax 10 million human beings, to govern them, to take a cut of everything they grew and wove and sold, and ship the proceeds home to investors half a world away. A corporation had quietly become a government over one of the most populous, productive lands on Earth. The decisive battle transformed a private trading company into a political power. And here is the thought I keep circling back to, the one I still find genuinely hard to hold in my head. Everyone in this story is a businessman. The conquest of Bengal was not carried out by a state pursuing glory or a faith seeking converts. It was carried out by a firm pursuing profit. The soldiers, the treaties, the puppet on the throne, the wealth drained out of a whole society, all of it was, at bottom, a return on investment for a group of shareholders. The empire didn't grow because a king willed it. It grew because it paid. And it was about to pay in ways that would cost human lives on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Because the machine had now discovered its true business. Not buying and selling, but owning. Owning land, owning revenue, owning people. In the Caribbean, in the Atlantic, in the workshops and fields of India, that discovery was about to turn into a system built on human beings themselves, bought, sold, worked to death, and taxed into famine, all to keep the money flowing back to a rainy little island that, only a lifetime earlier, had nothing to sell the world but wet wool. The wealth flowing back to the island did not come only from India. It came in vast quantities from something far uglier, from human beings themselves, bought on one coast of Africa, carried across an ocean in chains, and worked to death growing sweet things for European tables. To understand the second engine of the empire, forget kings and battles for a moment, and think about sugar. In the 1600s and 1700s, sugar did to Europe roughly what oil did to the 20th century. It was the new addiction, the thing everyone suddenly wanted and no one could get enough of. In tea, in coffee, in cakes, in rum. And it grew best in the hot, wet islands of the Caribbean, on plantations that needed one thing above all else to turn a profit: an enormous number of people willing to do brutal, killing labor in tropical heat. No one was willing, so the empire took them by force. The scale of what followed is one of those facts that the mind slides off because it's too large to hold. Britain became the single greatest slave-trading nation in the world. Over the course of the trade, British ships carried well over 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Picture a line of people, chained at the wrist, stretching from London to Beijing and back again, that begins to approach the number. Each one a person with a name, a family, a life torn out by the roots on one continent and dumped on another. And they were not treated as people.
On the ships, they were cargo. Merchants packed human beings into the holds of slave ships the way you'd pack crates, bodies laid side by side in the space too low to sit up in, for a voyage of weeks across the open Atlantic. A crossing so lethal it earned its own name, the Middle Passage. Historians estimate that on average, around 1 in 7 of the captives died on the way. From disease, from thirst, from despair, from the sheer engineered cruelty of the thing. Their bodies went over the side. It was, quite literally, an accounting matter. A certain loss of stock factored into the price. The plantations they reached were death machines dressed up as farms. The work of cutting cane and boiling sugar in the Caribbean heat killed people so fast that planters found it cheaper to work an enslaved person to death in a few years and buy a replacement than to keep them alive. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a second, because it's the coldest sentence in this whole story. A human life was, on the balance sheet, a consumable, cheaper to burn through than to preserve. And where did the profit go? Home. To the island. The money made from sugar and the bodies that grew it flowed back to Britain and built things you can still touch today. It built docks and warehouses in Bristol and Liverpool. Liverpool grew from a modest port into one of the great cities of Britain, substantially on the back of the slave trade. It built grand country houses. It funded banks and insurance houses, some of whose names still sit on high streets. It helped supply the capital that sloshed into the mills and mines of the coming Industrial Revolution. A country that a lifetime earlier had been poor and marginal was now, in part, financing its rise on a system that treated Africans as fuel. That's the part people find hardest to accept. Not that slavery existed, everyone knows it existed, but that it wasn't a shameful sideshow to the empire. It was one of its central engines. The sweetness in a London teacup and the wealth in a Bristol vault were the same substance, moved through the bodies of the enslaved. Now turn back to India, because the money flowing out of there tells a parallel story, quieter, drier, wrapped in the language of taxes and trade, and in the end, just as deadly. When the company won the right to tax Bengal, it discovered a way to make money that was better than trading. It could simply take. And a whole generation of British thinkers, watching from home, understood exactly what was happening and gave it a name. They called it the drain. The idea, argued most forcefully by an economist named Dadabhai Naoroji in the late 1800s, was blunt and devastating. Britain was pumping wealth out of India year after year and giving nothing back. He laid it out in a book with a title that says it all, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. And he put a number on it, arguing that tens of millions of pounds were being siphoned out of India every single year. Imagine a bathtub with the tap running but the plug pulled. That was India under the company. The water came in, the water went out, and the level never rose. The mechanism was almost elegant in its cruelty. The company taxed the Indian population, then used that Indian tax money to buy Indian goods, then shipped those goods to Britain and sold them. So India was, in effect, paying for its own wealth to be carried away. After Plassey, the company began purchasing goods for export using the tax revenue it had squeezed out of Bengal, rather than shipping in silver as it once had. The silver stopped coming. The plunder replaced it. And the human cost was not measured in pounds. It was measured in the dead. The single most horrifying episode came just a few years after the company took control. A drought struck Bengal, and drought had always been survivable in a well-run land. But this land was no longer being run for its people. The company kept demanding its taxes,
even raising them, even as the harvest failed and grain prices climbed out of reach. Company merchants and their agents were accused of hoarding rice to drive prices higher still, and the result was a famine of almost unimaginable scale. The Bengal famine of the early 1770s is estimated to have killed around 10 million people, roughly a third of the entire population of the region. A third. Imagine 1 out of every 3 people you have ever met gone in the space of a few seasons, in what had recently been one of the richest, most fertile lands on Earth. Even inside the company, some understood the horror of what they'd overseen. The governor at the time wrote home that the deaths had reduced the population, yet the tax revenue had held up, collected, as he put it, violently from the survivors. Squeezed from the living to make up for the dead. That is the drain made flesh. And the famines did not stop. Under British rule, India would be hit again and again by mass starvation, right into the late 19th century, killing many millions more, while grain was still being exported and the machinery of taxation ground on. This was happening in a land that had, before all this, been one of the world's great manufacturing powers. Its weavers had made the finest cotton cloth on the planet. And under company rule, that industry was strangled, its cloth taxed and undercut, its markets flooded with machine-made textiles from British mills, until the workshops that had clothed the world fell silent. A land that had exported finished goods was reduced to exporting raw cotton, so that it could buy back cloth made from its own material in Manchester. It's as if you took the best chef in the world, forced him to sell you his ingredients cheap, then sold him back his own dinner at a markup, and called it free trade. By the 1850s then, this is the picture. A private corporation ruling hundreds of millions of people, draining their wealth, presiding over repeated famines, backed by a private army of 250,000 soldiers, most of them Indian. It was a system stretched impossibly tight, and in the year 1857, it snapped. The spark, famously, was a rumor about a rifle. The company had issued a new type of cartridge, and to load it, a soldier had to bite the greased end off with his teeth. Word spread through the ranks of the company's Indian soldiers, the sepoys, that the grease was made from the fat of cows and pigs, an obscenity to Hindu and Muslim soldiers alike, cows being sacred to one faith and pigs forbidden to the other. Whether the rumor was true almost didn't matter. It was the match dropped into a room already thick with fumes, decades of resentment over broken faith, seized lands, arrogance, and the sense that a foreign company was trampling on everything sacred. In the spring of that year, at a garrison near Delhi, soldiers refused the cartridges, were punished and humiliated, and then rose. They shot their officers, threw open the jails, and marched. Within weeks, huge stretches of northern India were in open revolt. The rebels seized Delhi and rallied around the aged Mughal emperor, the last shadow of the dynasty the company had reduced to a pensioner, proclaiming him the leader of a war to throw the foreigners out. For a few months, it genuinely looked as though the whole edifice might come crashing down. What followed was savage on every side, and there's no clean way to tell it. The rebels committed massacres, the most notorious at a city where British men, women, and children, who had surrendered under a promise of safe passage, were killed, and the bodies thrown down a well. When news of that reached British ears, it unleashed a fury that shocked even some of the men carrying it out. British forces retaking the country burned villages, hanged prisoners in mass executions, and in some places, bound captured rebels over the mouths of cannons and blew them apart, a punishment chosen deliberately to terrify. The reconquest of Delhi and the other rebel cities was accompanied by killing on a scale that horrified observers who saw it. This was not a battle with a clear moral line. It was a spasm of mutual slaughter, and by the time it burned out, the death toll ran into the many thousands, with some estimates far higher,
when the reprisals and the disruption are counted. The rebellion was crushed, but it had done something the rebels never intended. It had exposed a fact that London could no longer ignore. A private company had no business ruling 250 million people. The whole absurd arrangement, a firm with shareholders governing a subcontinent, raising armies, going to war, had finally produced a catastrophe too large to defend. So the Crown stepped in. In the aftermath, the British government abolished the company's rule and took India directly under the authority of the state. The last Mughal emperor, in whose name the rebels had fought, was put on trial and exiled to Burma. And the dynasty that had once made company envoys prostrate themselves in the dust came to its final, quiet end. And a few years later, the Queen was proclaimed Empress of India. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a discount on pepper, grown into a company with an army, and stumbled into ruling a subcontinent by bribe and betrayal, was now, formally, officially, an empire, with a monarch's face on it and a crown on top. I find that turn genuinely remarkable. The empire did not begin as an empire. It backed into one, corporation first, and only put on the imperial costume after the whole thing nearly collapsed. The flag came last. And now the question that makes the whole story almost physically hard to believe returns with full force. How? How did a small, rainy island run all of this? A subcontinent, a chain of Caribbean islands, trading posts and forts scattered across every ocean, from thousands of miles away, in an age with no planes, no radio, no telephones. How do you give an order in London and have it obeyed on the far side of the world? The answer is the Navy, and everything the Navy made possible. Britain's genius was never really its army. Its army was often small. Its genius was the sea. The Royal Navy grew into the most powerful fighting force on the oceans, and its purpose was not just to win battles. It was to own the water itself, the great highway that connected everything. Control the sea lanes, and you control the movement of soldiers, silver, cloth, sugar, and orders. The empire was less a solid block of territory than a web, a network of ports and fortified harbors strung across the globe, joined by ships. Think of it less like a country and more like a spider's web laid over the whole planet, with the island at the center and the strands running out to every ocean. To keep that web taut, Britain seized the crucial knots, the choke points where the world's shipping had to pass. A rock at the mouth of the Mediterranean, a cluster of islands guarding the sea routes east, and later, a canal cut through the desert that shortened the voyage to India from months to weeks. Hold each of those, and no rival could move a fleet without your permission. Then came the age of steam, and the empire adapted with ruthless practicality. Steamships were faster and more reliable than sail, but they had one weakness. They ran on coal, and coal ran out. A steamship could only go as far as its next refill, so Britain built a chain of coaling stations, depots of coal dotted across the world's oceans. Every major port became a point where you could dump coal into the cargo hold, no matter where a British ship was. Another British-controlled harbor with a mountain of coal was never far ahead. It's the same logic as a network of filling stations laid out across a continent, so a car is never stranded. Except the stations were islands and fortified ports, and the fuel was coal shoveled by hand into the bellies of iron ships. And then, in the 1800s, came the invention that truly bound the whole thing together and shrank the world past recognition: the undersea telegraph cable. Engineers laid insulated copper wires along the ocean floor, stretching thousands of miles, linking Britain to India, to the Americas, to the far corners of its possessions. Before this,
An order sent from London to India traveled by ship and took months. A question asked in spring might not be answered until autumn. Now a message could cross the world in hours. Suddenly, the man in London could learn of a crisis in Asia the same day and fire back an instruction before nightfall. The empire had grown a nervous system. It could feel and react across oceans almost instantly. A rainy island reaching out and touching every continent through a copper thread on the seabed. Put all of it together, and you have a machine of astonishing reach. Ships to move armies and money faster than any enemy. Choke points to control the oceans. Coaling stations to keep the ships running. Cables to carry orders at the speed of electricity. It let a nation of a few tens of millions of people project power onto hundreds of millions of others, oceans away, and make it stick. But a web laid over the entire world touches a great many places, and a great many peoples who never agreed to be part of it. The same ships and cables and coaling stations were now carrying the empire into the heart of Africa, into deserts and jungles and kingdoms that had their own rulers, their own armies, and no intention of kneeling. And in those places, and across the wider world, the men and women being drawn into the web were beginning to push back, sometimes with words, sometimes with fire.
The machine had conquered a quarter of the planet. Now it was about to discover how much harder it is to hold something than to take it. The men who divided Africa did it in a room in Berlin in the winter of 1884 and 85, without a single African present. Picture the scene precisely, because it's one of the most quietly monstrous images in all of history. A grand chamber, a long table, a large map of Africa pinned to the wall, much of its interior still blank, marked in the honest ignorance of the age as unexplored. Around the table, representatives of more than a dozen European powers and their host, the German Chancellor. Over a period of months, these men negotiated who could claim what. They talked about rivers and coastlines and spheres of influence. They drew lines. And when they were done, they had carved up an entire continent, nearly a whole landmass, home to hundreds of nations and thousands of languages, among themselves, as casually as men dividing a carcass on a butcher's table. They had never walked the land they were slicing. Many of the borders they agreed on were drawn straight, perfectly straight, because a straight line is easy to draw on a map when you know nothing about what lies beneath it. If you look at a map of Africa today and see those long, ruler-straight frontiers marching across the desert and the plains, you are looking at the pencil marks of men who measured a continent from atlases in a heated European room. They set boundaries along lines of latitude, along rivers they'd never seen, along invisible geometry that meant nothing on the ground. And those lines hit living people. A border drawn to satisfy two European capitals would run straight through the middle of a single people, cutting a community in half so that a family, a market, a kingdom found itself split between two foreign empires that didn't even share a language. Trade routes that had run for centuries were severed by a frontier a clerk had invented. Kingdoms that had existed for generations were simply erased from the official maps, gone from the paperwork of the powerful, though still very much alive in the memory of the people who belonged to them. The essential rule of that Berlin conference was cold and clear. A European power could claim African territory only if it actually occupied and controlled it. So the map wasn't just a carve-up, it was a starting gun. It told every European power that to keep what it had claimed, it had to go and physically seize it. The scramble was on. Britain took the lion's share, a chain of possessions running the length of the continent, and it took them the way empires always do.
with soldiers, and with an overwhelming advantage in weapons. By now, the gap in firepower between an industrial European army and the peoples resisting it had become grotesque. The machine gun had arrived, and it turned battles into something closer to slaughter. There's a bitter little couplet from the era that captures the whole logic of the conquest in 2 lines. The boast that, whatever else happened, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. That was the truth of it. A few soldiers behind a machine gun could cut down attacking men by the hundreds. Imagine facing a storm of bullets with courage and spears, and you understand both the bravery of the resistance and the horror of what met it. Because there was resistance, fierce, sustained, and everywhere. This is the part the old imperial storybooks left out. Africa did not simply lie down. All across the continent, kingdoms and peoples fought back, sometimes for years. And in the crushing of that resistance, the empire and its European neighbors did things that the archives, their own archives, record in cold, damning detail. Take one episode that has a documented name and a date and a paper trail. In the southwest of Africa, at the start of the 20th century, a people rose against German colonial rule. This was a German colony, but it sat inside the same scramble, run by the same logic, and what happened there shows what the whole system was capable of. When the people, and later other groups, resisted, the German commander issued an extermination order. His words survive. He declared that those who rose were no longer German subjects, that any of them found within the territory, with or without a weapon, would be shot, and that he would not take in women or children, but would drive them back to their people, or let them be fired upon. And that is close to what happened. Survivors were driven into the desert to die of thirst, the waterholes poisoned or guarded, and the ones who were captured were put into camps. Historians now recognize what took place there as one of the first genocides of the 20th century, in which the great majority of an entire people was wiped out. And those camps are the detail that should stop you cold. Because we tend to imagine such things belong to a later, more infamous chapter of the century. They don't. They were here already, inside the Age of Empire. In camps across colonial southern Africa in this period, people were held in conditions that killed them by the thousands, worked to exhaustion, starved on rations that couldn't sustain a laborer, packed together where disease ran unchecked. The colonial records themselves list the deaths. This wasn't a battlefield accident. It was a system, documented in official ledgers, in which human beings were confined and consumed. The British Empire ran its own version of this brutality, and it too is in the archives. In its war against the Boer settlers in South Africa at the turn of the century, the British herded civilians, women and children among them, into camps, and tens of thousands died there of disease and malnutrition, a scandal so severe that a British campaigner brought the evidence home and forced her own government to reckon with it.
And decades later, in the fight to hold on to Kenya against an independence uprising, British forces detained huge numbers of people in a network of camps where documented abuse, torture, and killing took place. A chapter the British state tried to bury, literally destroying and hiding the files, until survivors won an acknowledgement and compensation in a British court within living memory. Read that again. The men who were tortured lived long enough to sue the empire that did it and win. The people who fought back were not a faceless mass, though the empire preferred to see them that way. There were leaders whose names their peoples still honor, figures known to their nations as symbols of resistance,
a spiritual leader whose call for liberation spread across a whole region, chiefs who chose to die fighting rather than sign away their land.
Most of the fighters, of course, left no names in any European record. They were the tens of thousands who stood in front of the machine guns and fell, remembered by their own families and villages, and by almost no one in the capitals that ordered their deaths. But the resistance was real, it was constant, and it meant that every square mile of that map drawn in Berlin had to be paid for in blood. Theirs overwhelmingly, but the Empire's too. For a while, the machine held. At its height, around the time of the First World War and just after, the Empire reached its greatest extent, that quarter of the planet, that quarter of humanity. It looked, from London, invincible. And then the same century that had perfected the machine gun turned it inward, on Europe itself, and the myth of the invincible empire began to die. The First World War drained Britain in a way no war ever had. It threw a generation of its young men into the mud of the trenches, and it emptied the treasury. To fight it, Britain borrowed on a colossal scale, and much of that borrowing was owed to the United States. The country that had been the world's banker, the island that lent money to the world, was becoming a debtor. And it had leaned hard on its empire to fight the war, pulling in more than 1 million soldiers from India alone, and hundreds of thousands more from Africa, the Caribbean, and the settler colonies. Men from across the empire fought and died for Britain, and they noticed, keenly, that they had been asked to bleed for freedoms they themselves were denied at home. The promise made to India during that war was self-government, someday, in exchange for its loyalty and its blood. When the war ended and the promise curdled into more repression, the whole relationship began to crack. And then a lawyer, trained in London, who had honed his methods fighting injustice in South Africa, came home to India and did something no army could have done. He organized mass, disciplined, non-violent defiance. Millions of ordinary people simply refusing to cooperate with their rulers. He led marches and boycotts and hunger strikes, and he was jailed again and again, and every time the empire jailed him, it looked weaker, not stronger. It's one of the strangest lessons of this whole story. The machine that had beaten armies with machine guns had no answer for a thin, quiet man in homespun cloth who simply would not fight back and would not obey. Then came the Second World War, and it finished what the First had started. Britain won it, but it won it broke. The war left the country buried under debt, its cities bombed, its treasury exhausted, dependent on American loans to keep the lights on. The old story that Britain was rich, invincible, permanent, a natural ruler of the world, could not survive the sight of the island itself battered and bankrupt, saved from starvation by borrowed money. And out in the colonies, the calculus shifted with brutal clarity. The soldiers who had once again been pulled in from across the empire to fight came home asking the only question that mattered. Why are we still ruled by them? What is this for? The power to say no had shifted, and the empire, exhausted and indebted, no longer had the strength or the money or the will to keep saying yes to itself. The unraveling came fast, and its most infamous scene was in India in 1947. Britain finally agreed to leave the land it had ruled for 2 centuries, but it left the way a butcher leaves a table, with a cut. As the British departed, the subcontinent was partitioned into 2 states, one with a Hindu majority, one Muslim. And the man sent out to draw the border between them was a British lawyer who had never set foot in India before, given a few short weeks and a set of outdated maps to decide the fate of hundreds of millions of people. He drew a line through provinces, through villages, through fields and families. And the line was not even published until after the transfer of power,
so that people did not know, until the last moment, which country they would wake up in. What followed was one of the largest and bloodiest movements of human beings in history.
Millions fled across the new border in both directions, Hindus and Sikhs one way, Muslims the other, in a panic of trains and columns and carts. And in the chaos, communities that had lived side by side for generations turned on each other. The violence killed enormous numbers of people. The estimates run into the hundreds of thousands, and by some accounts far higher, in massacres, in atrocities, in trains that arrived at their destinations carrying nothing but the dead. A border drawn by a stranger in a matter of weeks, on maps of dubious accuracy, set off a wound that has never fully closed. The two nations born from that partition have gone to war with each other more than once since, and the line that lawyer drew is still, to this day, one of the most militarized and dangerous borders on Earth. That is the phantom the Empire left behind. It vanished from the maps with astonishing speed. Within a couple of decades of that Indian midnight, colony after colony pulled down the British flag and raised its own. And the empire that had ruled a quarter of the planet contracted back, more or less, to the rainy island it had started from. On paper, it was over. The greatest empire in history simply dissolved. But it never really left the world. It's still here. You just have to know where to look. It's in the borders, those long, straight lines across Africa, and that scar across South Asia, still generating wars fought over decisions made by men who never saw the land. It's in the languages. This script is in English partly because a company chasing pepper turned into an empire that planted its tongue on every continent. It's in the wealth, the fortunes made from sugar and slaves and Indian taxes that seeded banks and cities and families whose descendants are comfortable today, and the poverty left behind in the lands that were drained. It's in the courtrooms, where the survivors of colonial camps, still alive, still testifying, forced a modern British government to admit to torture within the last handful of years. And it's in the descendants scattered across the world by the movements of empire, the people whose grandparents were carried in chains, or recruited to fight foreign wars, or shipped across oceans to labor, and who now live in the very heart of the island that once ruled them. That's the story of how an island came to hold a quarter of the world, and how the world is still, quietly, holding the shape it forced upon it. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the true stories underneath the ones we were taught, told honestly and in full, then subscribe and stay with this channel. There are a great many more of these to come, and the next one is already waiting.